Hello and welcome to PharmaSource. In today's episode, we talk about how AI and Pharma 4.0 can make real-world changes to pharma manufacturing. Our guest is Daniel O'Mahony, a digital transformation consultant in life sciences, working for Körber Pharma, and a part-time lecturer in Bioindustry 4.0 at the National Institute for Bioprocessing Research and Training. In this interview, we talk about how to get started with Pharma 4.0, a concept that applies the principles of Industry 4.0 to the pharma sector, and explore some of the ways that data science and automation can improve the productivity of pharmaceutical manufacturing, whether that's in-house or at a contract manufacturer. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Luke. Great to be here.
I mean, you've obviously got lots of experience on manufacturing and automation and all the changes which have been happening over the past decades. I was wondering if you could give us a bit of an overview on how you got to where you are, both as a consultant at Körber and also in your role as a part-time lecturer on Bioindustry 4.0. It'd be great to know a bit about your background, please.
Yeah, look, for me personally, I didn't always work in the pharmaceutical industry. Previously, I worked more on the electronics side and working with various electronics distributors and manufacturers in the US and in Europe. About 7 or 8 years ago, I had an opportunity to join a company that had just started to work on pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical supply chains, and they kind of wanted to do more of that type of business. So they'd asked me to come on board, but they kind of threw me in at the deep end, so to speak. So I have a science background, so I have a BSc in science, but it's been a long time since I had been out of college. So with that, I kind of took it upon myself to kind of try and learn the language of the biopharmaceutical world and the pharmaceutical world.
And how did you find that? Because it's not always the easiest.
We're very lucky, actually, in Ireland. And I think some of this is European funded as well, where the Irish government actually, when it comes to STEM type college courses, they've done a lot of sponsorship of courses here in Ireland. So they have a program called the Springboard program, which allows people either that are unemployed or even employed to take up on higher level STEM related courses. So I did ended up doing a master's degree actually with Griffith College Dublin. I did a diploma first one, then went on and did a master's degree there. And then later I actually went and did a second master's degree with Atlantic Technical University here in Ireland. But it was really on the back of those government programs that kind of, just made it very cost efficient, honestly, to do those, right? So that was a great introduction to the space. And then obviously you get to meet people and network with people. And then on my day job, I was starting to get more and more involved in the pharmaceutical realm at that point. So originally I worked on temperature control logistics for biopharma. I'd also done some work in the medical device space. And then I went to work with a company called Crest Solutions in Cork, here in Ireland, that concentrated on secondary packaging lines. So we did a lot of work around serialization systems and camera systems to manage labeling of product on mostly on secondary packaging lines. But I also got involved at that point as well on multivariate data analytics projects with Biopharma, and that kind of led into that second master's that I did as well. So look, we're putting all of that together, so to speak. That's how we kind of got into the industry. And then I just joined Körber Pharma Software, who a lot of people would better know as Verum Passex. I joined about this time last year, so I'm with the company for about 11 months now.
Great. Speaking about your current role then, what are the real world problems which people have at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, with Körber Pharma Software, like they're in a very positive position. They've built up a very good market penetration over, let's say, the last 20 or 30 years, all around the production of electronic batch records and manufacturing execution systems. So they have a good standing in the market from that perspective. A lot of their projects now are quite mature. So sometimes the projects are still dynamic from the point of view of the systems have to be upgraded, and particularly around cloud deployments, for example. And a lot of customers are interested in cloud deployments now. So the software and the systems have had to adapt to those new cloud infrastructures. So, and also sometimes the underlying architecture that might be a little bit older. Some of the supporting architectures like Oracle systems or Microsoft, for example, they become legacy, and the systems have to be updated from that perspective. So there's always a constant battle with for the customers to keep their system updated, particularly from a cybersecurity point of view. And then as more and more sites are not necessarily looking at cloud in its purest sense, but they certainly want something that has cloud-based architecture. So they might end up actually deploying systems on premise basis, so at their sites, or maybe on their own private cloud. But they want to have the capability eventually to move those systems to platforms like Azure and Amazon Web Services. So there's a lot of activity going on around that. And then for sites that already have systems, there's and this is where the Pharma 4 comes in. How do we start getting our systems, particularly around electronic batch records, how do we get those more integrated with our other systems that are on those sites? So if you go into a plant, there's literally a myriad of systems on those sites. So you have your ERP system, you have your lab information management system, you have your learning management system, you have your maintenance management system, you have your level 2 SCADA systems, distributed control systems, process control systems, etc., etc., etc. Right? And from a Pharma 4 point of view, what companies are trying to do now is to knit the data from all of these systems together into one central data pool where they can start running analysis from, or start automate their business processes by having access to the data from all these different systems. So that's the other, I suppose, real interest from customers at the moment.
On your point about ERP, we ran a really interesting webinar recently with Dr. Eloise Epstein from Kearney and Partners, and one of the points she's making as part of the new book she's got coming out is that the future of all supply chains, but also life sciences supply chains being a big part of that. The way she phrases it is that ERP is dead, and that the future of this connected ecosystem, everything will be running through cloud platforms, whether that's your Google's, Azure's, AWS. Interested to know your take on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's probably a bit to go maybe on that. I'm not disagreeing in what she's saying, but then you have people like SAP, for example, who in themselves are moving to cloud-based based platforms as well. I do think you have coming through what I would call alternative IT stacks and OT stacks. So, for example, there's ERP providers like Odoo who ostensibly are offering ERP for free, although when you start to tweak it or get advice in any way, obviously they charge the same as everybody else, and they have their own models around that. I know of one customer that's changed their ERP system 3 times in 10 years, which I wouldn't advise anybody to do because of the knock-on effects of that. But looking at those ERP systems, making changes, they're because they're so complex and they cover such a wide remit from going from finance to supply chain. People have to be very careful about that, and sometimes the cost investment around these as well is so expensive that they tend to be very long marriages and very expensive divorces. So if you go to change your ERP model, then the impact of that in the business is quite substantial. So look, I'm not disagreeing in what she's saying, but you might be measuring the impact of that in decades rather than years, I would imagine.
Yeah. Is it possible, do you think, to make the transformational changes needed using the existing ERP stack going on in the background? You could still get there.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think so. And in terms of maybe moving that to the cloud, for example, yes, you can do it now. It takes a huge effort from the vendors of those systems to do that, right? Because if you had 30, 40 years of development work that's gone in to meet customer requirements, and then you have to take all of that and put that into a new cloud architecture, then it takes substantial effort to do that, and everything has to be done, has to be translated exactly correctly. And then there's the elements as well around customization. So a lot of times customers say, well, in our particular scenario, we want to do it this way because we've got these unique circumstances. So we need to have some level of customization. When you look at cloud systems, and to get the benefit of cloud systems, particularly from a cost perspective, you have to have the least amount of customizations in those platforms. And that's where things like APIs become important, right? So if you can have a common platform, whether that be ERP or MES or any of these other systems, without customizations, right? But at the same time, have API interfaces, for example, that can connect with other systems without actually affecting the core of of those main platforms. Then that's a very workable situation, as opposed to trying to customize everything, which a lot of legacy systems tend to have a lot of customization on them.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is Pharma 4.0 then, Dan? Is there a snappy definition of it, and why is it so important for the future of pharma and bio?
Yeah, so I suppose there's two elements to this actually. So first of all, the term Pharma 4.0 is a term that's used by the ISP, the International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineers. And it was actually my colleague, Dr. Christian Volbelling, that actually come up with that phrase.
Uh-huh.
Currently, after a conference over a few beers one night, but and they have a whole framework around that. But essentially, even before you get to that point, the first instance is actually to look at Industry 4.0 and where that came from, right? And actually that's quite German centric in its history. I think it was in around 2012 mark, something like that this concept started to bubble through, and it was done as a concept paper coming out of sponsored by the German government actually. And if you look at what they're talking about in that original document, what they're talking about is, just as we spoke about earlier, integration of systems horizontally across the plant floor, for example. So connecting your supply chains and your ERP systems, your MES systems. So you're trying to connect systems both vertically and horizontally. So vertically, first of all, we should say around what we call the ISA 95 stack, where you can connecting equipment that's on the floor with your manufacturing execution system for your batch records, and then your ERP systems, and then even above that again, now with those serialization platforms, where you're actually communicating data off to regulators and to government authorities. And then horizontally, you're trying to connect maybe your supplier networks, your supplier data, and your customer data at the other side. And then also it talks about data traveling with the product across the product life cycle, right? So from the design phase to the production phase and to end of life, that the data that's associated with each individual product or recipe or SKU is tracked the whole way through the process. So essentially, that's essentially Industry 4.0. When it comes to Pharma 4.0, then that's kind of extended into things like validation. So how can you help digitalize validation, and how can, like Industry 4.0, how can you ensure that the validation data is tracking right through with a product or a process, right through the life cycle of the process or the product. That's one element of it. Then you have things like we call it a plug and produce. So again, this is around integration of systems, so that you've got a new equipment that comes onto the network on the pharmaceutical shop floor, that without a huge amount of validation, that you can essentially plug that in and it's ready to go, right? And that's not the circumstance today. Today, the amount of validation effort that goes around new equipment or new processes is very substantial, right? And then there could be elements around regulatory as well. How can we communicate better with regulators, and how can that exchange of data become more streamlined? And then it goes into things like training and availability of people and the development of people and all of that as well.
So what are the main benefits for the industry of implementing this type of approach?
Yeah, so I suppose, look, in the first instance, you're always trying to attract talent into the industry. We know that skilled workers for the pharmaceutical industry are very hard to get, just because the industry is growing so much, right? Some of the work that's involved in pharma, going back to validation, for example, filling out very long paper-based forms and going through all of the test results. Sometimes not exactly the most exciting work of all time, right? So if you can help make people's life easier, still getting to the same result, but working smarter by making the movement of data easier, then I think that makes life a lot easier for everybody, right? The second thing, then, obviously, you're always looking for better productivity and better yield in processes. So, using things like data analytics, maybe eventually using things like artificial intelligence to look at data to find process improvements. That's obviously a holy grail that's out there as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I would caution that that ambition is tempered by two things. One is from a regulatory point of view, because the processes tend to be locked in and licensed, that even if you can find a better yield improvement or a better quality improvement, sometimes you're locked into your license and it's a little bit more difficult to make a process change.
So you wouldn't be able to implement that process efficiency?
Not always, because it just so if let's say you found a change in process that let's say made an improvement, to actually go back to the regulator and say, oh, by the way, we want to actually change that parameter.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of effort that goes around that, people might just say, you know what, let's just stick to anything and keep it as it is, right?
Could you give me some examples of that, please, Dan? I mean, when you've seen those types of waste reduction or yield improvement efficiencies?
Yeah, there's papers out there from an academic point of view. I know that Pfizer published a paper a number of years ago. It was quite influential to me personally, where they saw, I think it was a 10% yield improvement in a bioreactor based on the types of analysis that they were carrying out, right? So that would be one example. That's a published example. Another one publicly, I think Janssen would have spoken quite publicly about their vaccine development programs. So they would have said that, first of all, in moving through the clinical trials really quickly, the way they were able to handle and analyze their data was a big driver in being able to move the clinical steps through so quickly to get to commercialization. I think they've spoken publicly about that. And then the other piece, I think, is quite popular in the advanced therapeutics now for the cell and gene therapies, for example. So this concept of quality by design, which is, I think, developed by the International Committee for Harmonization. I can't remember which paper exactly, but they will talk about, actually, when you're designing the processes now, that there's flexibility built into that if you do decide to change a process parameter further on down the line to, let's say, create a yield improvement, for example, that you have enough data built up about the process in advance and enough knowledge about the process to allow you to make that change without having to go back to the regulator. That's the idea. But and definitely that's available to all of the pharma companies, but definitely the cell and gene people I think are really working towards that from the get-go. And that opportunity to do a quality by design process and to have some flexibility in your regulatory submission, that's been around for a while. But actually, if you look at the number of submissions that have actually been made to either the Food and Drug Administration or to the European Medicines Agency, there are only a handful of applications that have been done that way, right? But from what I've seen, the cell and gene sites are from the get-go, they're using that methodology much more. So it's all about doing the data analysis, doing the work up front, understanding your processes up front, and then later, as your processes mature, you can feel more comfortable to make changes within normal operating ranges to get process improvements, and you don't have to go back to the regulators to make those changes.
If you take a typical company's manufacturing operations, what would you say the main sort of buckets, if you like, of areas for improvement are for implementing Pharma 4.0 methodologies? So, I mean, I'm thinking about areas such as process development and supply chain, quality control. It'd be interesting to know what the opportunities are in those different types of areas, please.
Yeah. First of all, while it is making a big impact on that clinical design phase, for sure, the AI applications that people are talking about. So, for example, the Google DeepMind program, where they're looking at protein binding and protein structures. So to select molecules for clinical trials, that seems to have been a big success and has really speeded up the development process. So definitely right at the really beginning of the product lifecycle and the start of the supply chain, that's definitely one area that's is already having an impact. And then I think there was another one that recently, in terms of selection of chemical molecules for antibiotic treatments. Again, using AI to consider thousands of candidate molecules. It was able to find molecules that were had big impacts in terms of antibiotic resistance. and offer new antibiotics again in a fraction of the time that it would normally take.
In drug discovery and speeding up R&D, there's some really interesting examples there.
Correct. Then I think, to answer your question, in terms of the larger scale productions or in the manufacturing space, I think there's still an awful lot of work to be done on what we call level 2 integration, right? So getting your equipment connected into your manufacturing execution system and taking data from different equipment sources. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, a lot of potential to get more data from the systems that are already there. And you'd be surprised that very large billion-dollar industry companies, sometimes they have all of these really fantastic, very well controlled individual processes, but getting the data out, they're still struggling a little bit, right? Or the other point is, if you look at biopharma, right, and something like 65% of new drugs now are biopharmaceutical products rather than traditional small molecule products, right? If you look at the downstream purification steps, for example, or even the upstream bioreactor steps in those processes, they're still very manual processes, right? There's people that are gowned up, they're working in pairs, and they're carrying out what are very manual processes, and they're carrying those out very, very methodically, right? So there's still a high degree of art and science, and it's not all automation and robotics. So, for example, you compare robotic applications in pharmaceutical compared to medical device, for example. Much higher use of robotic applications in medical device than you would have in pharmaceutical, for example. But now there is exceptions to that, and there are some companies out there that are going towards what they call dark factory, which is where things are operating without human intervention.
Oh, is that like Amazon dark warehouses?
Correct. Yeah, they don't need lights because there's nobody in there.
People.
Yeah, and there you definitely from a warehouse perspective, and some pharma companies they have that, but it's moving. In some cases, it's moving a little bit more into the production area as well.
What about in the supply chain? How would you describe the use of manufacturing execution systems?
Sometimes manufacturing execution systems tends to do what they say on the tin, and they tend to be circled around or centered around the manufacturing process. So you're thinking more about recipes and SKUs and equipment and cleaning and all of that kind of stuff. That's kind of where they come into their own. And then your ERP system tends to communicate to suppliers and to customers, because you have the whole financial element that goes in there, right? However, I think there is a change there. So, for example, if you look at a contract manufacturing organization, right? So if they're using an MES system, then they're producing batch records, right? It should be within their capability for their customers to have access to those electronic batch records as they're being produced, to actually, along with the qualified persons that might be in the CMO, but the actual customers, the contracted party for the CMO could also have access to those electronic batch records and actually see the process for their product as it's going along in the production process, and see have the analytics been done, how long more before the product will get released. All that information is there in those electronic batch records, and there's nothing stopping the customers seeing their own data there even before the product is released. So that would have a supply chain impact. The other thing I think to think about as well is, which is kind of blows your mind a little bit, right? But if you look at an ERP system traditionally, and it's managing both the suppliers at one end and it's managing the customer data at the other side, right? And with the MES somewhere in between. If you look at cell and gene therapy, now your supplier is actually also your customer stroke patient, because the raw material that's coming in the back door is actually coming directly from the clinical area, right? So so now the supply chain is really getting knitted together, and I think where you're looking at a batch of one, and each individual step is so important, right? And that it's done correctly. I think MES definitely has a role in there to ensure that for that individualized medicine and that single patient, that each individual process step has been carried out correctly, and that all knits in together with the rest of the supply chain. Because sometimes the timelines that are involved here in doing this are very, very short. Certainly weeks in terms of getting samples from the customer, getting it to the production areas, making the personalized medicine, and getting it out the door again to the clinic.
Yeah. A huge amount there, isn't there? Where would you suggest people should get started, if they want to make some of these changes, is that something which can be done in-house? Do they need to bring in third parties? How would someone get started on this journey?
I think, first of all, from an in-house perspective, I see a lot of companies that are forming teams, and they are trying to figure out a lot of this stuff for themselves first, right? And to get some level of, let's say, education or some level of competency before they reach, they would reach out, right? And there's lots of consultancy companies and tools out there that people can use. So, for example, like one of the things that out there, certainly things like Bioforum, where they offer digital maturity assessments to see, okay, how does your site maybe rank compared to other sites? That can be very useful to see, to make a plan for how a site can develop further. Organizations like the ISPE or the Parental Drug Association, again, very important because it allows you to look outside your own organization to find out what's going on elsewhere. And then, there's lots of consultancy companies that can help on this, and those companies are probably knocking on your door already as it is. But the one thing I would caution at the same time is you do have to be careful as well, right? So you do have what I would call, you have the technology readiness level in the sense, so not every technology is ready for the big time. Is one thing. So the first thing most customers want to know is who else is doing this and how are they doing it. So the concept of the second mouse getting the cheese is important here. Right? Maybe you don't want to be the very first to experiment.
Well, it's like the whole Gartner hype cycle, isn't it?
I was just going to say that. And my favorite phrase, which is the trough of disillusionment right there in the middle of that, right? It takes these technologies 20 years or so to go from one end of that hype curve to the other, right? So the early adopters, maybe depending on their business case, are happy to do that. But, sometimes people want to see who's gone first and let a few other sites try things out before we jump in. And the last point I would make on that is what's really, really important is this idea of business cases, right? So if you're going to do a project around integrating different systems, for example, on your site, right, you do have to sit down and think out for yourself, okay, what's the positive impact of the business? What kind of benefits to the business could we see? Can we express that in a pound or a euro or a dollar value, for example? And what's in it for all of the different stakeholders that are on the site? Because there's no one decision maker, generally speaking, on the sites. Everybody has to contribute to these decisions. So, what do automation say about this? What do quality say about this? What do environmental health and safety say about this? What do finance say about it? What does the regulatory people say about this? So you have to bring all of those people with you, and you have to build a business case, making it positive for all of those different stakeholders.
So, on that Gartner hype cycle example, out of all of the different types of technologies, which are the ones which you'd say are now on the, forget what it's called, the plateau of productivity? So the ones which really, if you put them in a business case, it should be by this stage provable ROI, and you should just get on and do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, it's funny if you do look at that end of the hype curve, so to speak. Just from memory, things like MES is one of those that is out the other side. 20 years later or 30 years later, it's there. And definitely, if you're a paper-based site today, I think there's a very strong ROI for an MES system. I would be pretty confident around that. It's a little bit more difficult to prove as you're upgrading MESs. If you have already an existing EBR, but you want to progress it, that then it gets a little trickier. Things like electronic logbooks, I think, are also there at that end of the curve. And then you have things like serialization systems and track and trace systems that are also at that end of the curve. But that was so driven by the regulators kind of made you do it in that case. So manufacturers didn't have a choice.
In terms of Körber, how do you like to involve customers in your product development and work with them on these solutions?
Yeah, no, so it's a really good question actually, and it kind of goes back to that. That kind of lean methodology, thinking about voice of customer, or that quality thing about having voice of customers, and it's so important. So from a Körber software perspective, we would try our best to stay as close to customers as we can. So we have launched, and we've been doing this for years, but just recently we kind of revamped it a little bit. We have what we call a PASIX community now, where customers can basically get together and they talk about functionality that they would like to see in the system, or improvements that they would like to see in the system. And those suggestions are ranked and prioritized among the community, and then they're fed to our developers, and our developers then actually go and work on them. So we actually have a feedback channel from the customer base directly into the product development teams. So look, and the product development teams, obviously take a lead in some of this stuff as well, particularly as you move now towards the cloud infrastructure, so to speak. A lot of that is led by our own people, but there's particular functionality that the customers want to ensure that's there, or new functionalities that they want to ensure that comes into those new versions of our product. So we would try and stay as close to the customer as possible around that. And as that PASIX community is one way we do it. There's some regional group community meetings that we would have as well, both in the States and in Europe, again, to try and keep us connected with the customers as we can to make those product improvements.
Great, thank you. Is there any final word of advice you could give to someone who wants to make some of these changes which you're talking about? They're working in life sciences, which is a highly regulated industry. It can be difficult sometimes to make things happen. Any word of advice you could share?
What I found very useful myself is going back to those industry bodies, particularly ISPE, for example, the Parent and Drug Association organization I mentioned. There's always chapters of these organizations locally. So to go and meet with your colleagues in other pharmaceutical sites and to discuss some ideas with them, to find out what they've been working on, what worked for them, what didn't work for them, to kind of get the feeling that you're not alone, I suppose, is the big thing, right? And then also that you can bring back to your business then experience that happened on other sites, and you can bring some evidence from other sites with you, and that makes maybe the stakeholders in your own site much more comfortable. It gives them a lot more confidence if they know that X, Y, and Z company down the road has already done that. Maybe they can actually organize a site visit and go and visit. And I have to say, I found the industry really good at that. That people are very open. Obviously, there's some competition goes on at times, but generally speaking, if a project has worked well, or if something is deployed, people are happy to show it to other companies that might be interested. So that's the one piece of advice I would give is to go to work with your industry organization. It's like everything else. The more you put into these things, the more you get back out.
Dan, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking to you today.
Thanks very much, Luke. Talk to you again. Thank you.
Thanks to Dan for taking the time today. For more insights and best practices, head to pharmasource.global, where you can register as a member of our community. Thank you for listening.